Welcome from Museum of the Bible in Washington, D.C. I'm standing in our People of the Land exhibition. Created by the Israel Antiquities Authority, this features 700 artifacts that highlight the history and archaeology of ancient Israel. If you have seen the Case for God series featuring Rabbi Soloveichik, this spot might look familiar to you. Museum of the Bible is honored to be one of the filming sites for that series in partnering with the Tikvah Fund, as well as on other educational programming, and in particular this program here tonight, The Case for God, A View from Jewish History. It is my honor to introduce to you virtually Eric Cohen. He is our host for this evening's conversation, and he is the executive director of the Tikvah Fund. He is also founder and editor-at-large of The New Atlantis and publisher of the Jewish Review of Books and of Mosaic. He is also author of In the Shadow of Progress, Being Human in the Age of Technology, and co-editor of The Future is Now, America Confronts the New Genetics. His writings have been published in the Wall Street Journal, Washington Post, Mosaic, Commentary, The Weekly Standard, New Republic, First Things, and many other publications. It is my honor to introduce virtually Eric.
Well, Jeff, thank you so much for the kind introduction and for being such a remarkable partner in bringing this series on Jews, the Case for God, to life. And in this conversation we're going to have this evening on the meaning of Jewish history. We're living in a moment where America, where the West, need to rediscover our biblical roots more than ever. The message of Jerusalem, the Hebraic story, all the wisdom and richness that the Bible has to offer us. And there's really no place I've ever been, certainly in America, that brings that biblical story to life more powerfully than the Museum of the Bible. And at Tikvah, we're really honored to be partnering with you on this project. To bring the story of the Bible to life and the wisdom of the Bible to life, we also need religious and intellectual leaders. And it's our real honor tonight to be in conversation with Rabbi Dr. Meir Soloveichik, who really is one of the most thoughtful, creative, inspiring Jewish thinkers in the world today. He's the senior rabbi of the Spanish-Portuguese synagogue, the oldest congregation, the oldest Jewish congregation in the country, the founder of a very important intellectual center called the Strauss Center for Torah and Western Thought at Yeshiva University, and for our purposes, a partner on many, many projects with the Tikvah Fund, including this remarkable series of videos that we were privileged to film at the Bible Museum called Jews, the Case for God. Rabbi Soloveichik, it's an honor to be here with you tonight.
Thank you, Eric. It's a joy to be with you.
So, why don't we just start by trying to understand this big idea, the big idea that the miracle of Jewish history, the sheer improbability of the survival of this small group of people with a big message for the world was perhaps a revelation or evidence of God's hand in history. How did you come to formulate the Jewish story in this way?
So the idea that came to me, that ultimately was the idea for which I argue in this series, derived from the curious fact that as a rabbi, the most primal religious experiences that I've had have taken place in museums rather than in a synagogue or in a yeshiva. Now, that may make me a terrible rabbi, and I've had religious experiences there as well, of course. But the moments of extraordinary faith, radiant faith, have occurred in what would seem to be the most unlikely of places, which are exhibits about ancient civilizations that can be found in museums all over the world. In the Bible Museum, in the British Museum, in the Louvre, and all over the world, Berlin, elsewhere. And what struck me as I visited these museums, and you encounter an exhibit about an ancient empire, is several things. First, invariably, these were ancient empires that not only once bestrode the world like a colossus, these were ancient empires that tried to enslave, persecute, or destroy the Jewish people. That's an ongoing theme in Jewish history. At the same time, those empires are gone. Every single one of them is an embodiment of Shelley's famous poem about Ozymandias. It proclaims their power. My name is Ozymandias, King of Kings. Look upon my works, ye mighty, and despair. and ultimately nothing beside remains round the decay of that colossal wreck, boundless and bare, the lone and level stand stretched far away. So they're gone. On the other hand, the very people they persecuted are still here. And so if in the exhibits the people of Israel come up, there are descendants of the people of Israel, myself among them, who can go visit it. You don't have Hittites visiting the Hittite exhibit in the British Museum. You don't have Moabites saying, you know what, I'm going to go visit my ancestors and their statues in the Louvre, in the Moabite exhibit of the Louvre. The Louvre has a Moabite exhibit, but there ain't no Moabites who are coming to visit there. And so that's began to strike me as I continued to visit these museums. And the religious implications of that were perhaps best captured by a writer and Walker Percy, and a small essay which I'm delighted to say you introduced me to after many discussions about this.
A Catholic novelist.
A Catholic novelist, a convert to Catholicism, a novelist, but in a series, one essay which was just ruminations of his. He wrote something like this. Walker Percy wrote, "Why does no one find it remarkable that today in London or New York, there are no Hittites, but there are still Jews, even though the Hittites were once a prominent and powerful civilization, while the Jews nearby were a weak and obscure country." And then he writes, when one meets a Jew on the streets of London or Melbourne or New York, it is remarkable that no one finds the event remarkable. But it is even more remarkable that no one asks, if there are Jews here, why are there no Hittites here? And then he concludes, show me one Hittite in New York City. Now, given who I've met in New York City, if they were Hittites, some of them, that would explain a lot. But the fact is there are no Hittites in New York City. And so you have all these ancient empires sought to destroy the Jewish people, and only the Jews endure. So you have that. And finally, it's not only that Jews seem to have immortally existed. It's not just that all attempts to destroy them have failed, even as those very empires that made this attempt ended up on the ash heap of history. It's also the fact that these attempts, these failures, the Jewish survival, and ultimately the Jewish return to the Holy Land, was all predicted by Jewish scripture thousands of years ago. At one point, an obscure and tiny people comes out of nowhere. And no matter, let's leave aside for a minute the debates about who wrote the Bible. Obviously, I'm a rabbi, and I believe that the Bible was divinely revealed. But let's leave that aside for a minute. Everyone agrees that at one point, a small, ancient people came out of nowhere and announced that they had been chosen by God to change the world, that their ideas would impact the world, and that they would be at the center of world history. They also predicted that because of the doctrines that they proclaimed, a single God who created the world, the inviolability of man because man is created in the image of God, and a whole host of ideas around that, they would be hated and persecuted. And yet they also, and at certain points, because of their sins, those who hated them might exile them. But these very same people also predicted that all attempts to destroy them would fail, that ultimately those who attempted this destruction would disappear, and that this people would one day return to their land, the land would flourish, Jerusalem would be rebuilt, and so forth. All this was predicted thousands of years ago. People of faith, those who are not people of faith, admit this prediction was made. The only question that remains is, have these predictions been fulfilled or not? Has it come true? I think it has. So what are we to make of it? You could say it's all coincidence. Or you could say what I think is the more likely answer, indeed the Occam's razor answer, that the story of the Jews is today the greatest case for God.
So let's look at some of these stories and the artifacts that bring them to life. So one of the foundational stories in the Hebrew Bible is the story of Egypt and of this enslavement and then eventually the divine liberation of the Jewish people. So one of the artifacts, replica of the artifact in the Bible Museum where we filmed one of these episodes is the Merneptah stele. Yes. So what was the Merneptah stele, and what is its revelatory significance, as you say?
So the Merneptah stele, which sits in the Cairo Museum and has an amazing replica in the Museum of the Bible in D.C., was discovered in 1896 by an archaeologist, Flinders Petrie. And at first blush, it just seemed to be a standard monument that would have been set up by an ancient tyrant, effectively, describing all of his military victories. And it could be true, it could be not true. It's propaganda. What set this one aside is two facts. First, the pharaoh who created this stele, Merneptah, is the son of Ramesses II, or Ramesses the Great, who is believed to be, for various reasons, the likeliest candidate for the pharaoh of the Exodus story. So this would be the son of the pharaoh of the Exodus. And secondly, on this stele, Petri discovered, there is actually the first mention of the people of Israel outside the Bible. So this is, in other words, the oldest mention of the people of Israel outside the Bible. That's why he was excited. But from the perspective of Jewish history, here's what's really interesting about it. The stele doesn't just mention Israel. It describes the destruction of Israel. It says, Israel is laid waste, its seed is not. Which means, if I can cite the eloquent words of my friend, the late, great Rabbi Jonathan Sacks, the oldest mention of the people of Israel outside the Bible is an obituary. And yet the very authors of the obituary are the ones who are gone. There is no Egyptian empire. It is literally all in museums, or all at sites and ruins.
Egypt is now a remnant.
Egypt is now a remnant.
We're a living people.
And we are still a living people. I'll add something to this that I read recently, which I found striking. So if you go to the Cairo Museum, where the original Merneptah stele is, you could actually come face to face, literally, with the man who was believed to be the pharaoh of the Exodus, because they have Ramesses II lying in a glass case, unwrapped. You could see the body of Ramesses II. You can look at the man who may have been the man that Moses stood before. You are seeing the same person. And so a couple decades ago, I read that there was a certain decomposition that took place in the body of Ramesses II. And the body needed to be taken to France, I believe. And what was reported, I think this is true. Obviously, I read it on the internet, and obviously it must be true. But the rule was that any human being leaving the country, even if that person had been dead for thousands of years, needed a passport. And so they created a passport, and you'll find mock-ups. I don't think those are the real passports. You'll find a mock-up of what it might have looked like, an Egyptian passport for Ramesses II. Now, most people read that and they say, that's amusing, that's funny, that a mummy of someone who's been dead for thousands of years needs a passport. But if you look at that through the lens of Jewish history, you immediately think to yourself, thousands of years ago, Moses stood before what may have been this man and said, I'd like to leave your country. Let my people go. And Pharaoh said no. And now, the very same people that Moses led out to the Holy Land, they're now in the Holy Land. And the Pharaoh who said no, not only is his entire empire gone, but now he needs a passport. Ramesses II needs a passport to leave the country, to be let go, to be saved from decomposition, because only his body has been preserved, but everything that he stood for is gone. And so you see, to think about it, to see history through the lens of Jewish history, it's not just that you see the endurance of Israel or the fulfillment of biblical promises. You see these notes, if you will, of grace, poetic notes in history, providential notes in history. Ironic, but therefore divine, I think.
So, obviously, many of us have read about the miracle of the liberation of the Jews, the parting of the Red Sea from Egypt. One of the other stories you bring to life is the confrontation with Assyria.
Yeah. And
you even describe that as potentially an even greater miracle.
Yeah.
So what was that story?
So this was, it's very striking that you describe it accurately as one of the great dangers and one of the greatest miracles that has ever occurred, because on the one hand, this is a story that's not well known. It's in the Bible, but It's as they might say, somewhere toward the back.
It's a little later.
It's somewhere toward the back.
It's in the third act,
right? As the
fifth act.
I think that as they once asked on The Simpsons to the minister when he said something theologically off, they said, "But doesn't it say in the Bible such and such?" And he says, "I think it may be somewhere toward the back." Right? So this is.
So what's this miraculous story?
This is, and yet on the other hand, the miraculous story involves an enemy that may well be the person who has wrought the greatest destruction on the people of Israel until Hitler. Much more than Pharaoh, because Pharaoh only enslaved Israel. And until Hitler, we may have never faced such a great enemy and such a dire state of Jewish existence. So this really unfolds, the enemy is Assyria, the Assyrian Empire, and it unfolds over several kings or emperors of Assyria, culminating in Sancherib. So this is unfolding around, starting from 701 BCE, around that, and going into the 600s BCE. And at this point, Assyria has become the superpower in the Middle East. And as those who read the Bible know, that biblical Israel has at this point become divided into two kingdoms, a northern kingdom of 10 tribes and a southern kingdom. The northern kingdom is conquered entirely by Assyria, and what Assyria would do in contrast to every other empire is that they wouldn't just subjugate the people that they conquered, because that can cause problems. The people they subjugate can revolt. Indeed, that's what Jews usually did when they were subjugated by other empires. And so instead, very cleverly, what they would do is they would exile them and forcibly assimilate them and bring other people into the country they conquered. So Assyria takes the 10 northern tribes of Israel, exiles them, and assimilates them. They're lost. Those are called the 10 lost tribes. So even if we think that some might have returned or found by perhaps Jeremiah, etc., until Hitler we have this enemy, someone who has destroyed, not murdered them, but destroyed them of their identity, 10 out of 12 tribes. Think about how many people have been lost from the people of Israel because of Assyria. Now at this point, the man who has already earned this terrible legacy, now the empire that has earned this legacy, the heir to this empire, Sancherib, sets his sights on the southern kingdom, which is ruled from Jerusalem by the throne of David. He first assaults other cities in Judah, that's the southern kingdom, Judea, destroys the city of Lachish, wreaked so much destruction there that he actually set up a depiction, almost like a photographic depiction etched in stone for his palace, all of which you can see if you go to the British Museum today. There's a whole Assyrian wing. You can go there and see it. And you will see your ancestors, the Jews, being led into exile, being flayed, being placed on pikes. All that unfolds in the description of the siege and conquest of Lachish. Then Sancherib sets its sights on Jerusalem, surrounds Jerusalem. Now, if the assault on Jerusalem succeeds at this point, without question, that would be the end of the Jewish people, because even when all the other tyrants in history have succeeded partially in their aims, there were always Jews elsewhere. Hitler destroyed 6 million Jews, but there were other Jews. But this was it. Had he succeeded here, that would have been the end of Judaism. And we actually have another record from Sancherib the king, where he describes, "I have surrounded Jerusalem and trapped Hezekiah the king like a bird trapped in his cage." But after that, we have nothing. Nothing from Assyria. No description of the conquest of Jerusalem, which should have followed. And Jerusalem still exists after Assyria. So we have the biblical account, which is that at that night, an angel of God came out and destroyed all 185,000 Assyrian troops besieging Jerusalem, which leads to a verse which in Hebrew reads, and the standard English translation, I consider it unintentionally the funniest verse in the Bible, because it reads, "Vayashkim baboker v'inei kulam pegarim metim." It was when they woke up in the morning that they were dead. We've all been there. Right? So now if you think about that, this is at least the greatest salvation, the greatest miraculous salvation of the people of Israel since the splitting of the sea. Because that was the last time for the Bible that everything was on the line. Now, I of course believe that occurred. If you don't believe that occurred, well, we know what happened at Lachish. You can go to the British Museum and see it. We know that Jerusalem was besieged. Sancherib himself admits it. So why are there still Jews? But perhaps, Eric, as miraculous as the fact that Jews were saved then is the fact that now I can go as a Jew to Jerusalem and I could see the very wall that King Hezekiah put up during the siege. It's called the Broad Wall. You can all go to the old city of Jerusalem and see it. Well, how can I be a Jew standing there today? Assyria is long gone. Assyria disappeared soon after that as an empire. Babylon became the superpower. So, how are we to explain this? Those are moments where, even though they're not a museum, they happen to be in Jerusalem, that these moments that these extraordinary moments of faith come. For me, speaking personally.
So, it's almost Hanukkah.
Yeah.
Another holiday of Jewish miracles. Another holiday that tells a story of a Jewish confrontation with a rival civilization, in this case, Greece. What's the Hanukkah story? And what's the insight there about the meaning of Jewish history?
So first of all, we should make the case that Hanukkah should really be a holiday, not just for Jews, but for Christians and for all biblical monotheists. And that's why everyone watching this should send Hanukkah presents to me, courtesy of Tikvah.
I think it's the opposite.
Everyone.
Now you have to send Hanukkah presents to every Christian.
That's not how I make the rule. I'm the rabbi here. I make the rules. And the
This
reason,
is very good for Christian young people.
and the reason for that, of course, is everybody should be sending me, Rabbi Meir Soloveichik, presents. I like 18-year-old scotch, in case you wonder.
That's
Okay.
great. While you watch The Simpsons.
Well,
It's a very inspiring image of Jewish
exactly.
intellectual leadership.
Religion at the museum, send me your Hanukkah presents. But what's striking is, what I mean by this is, what do I mean that everyone should celebrate Hanukkah? Because this was another moment where not the physical existence of the Jewish people was on the line, but the faith of Judaism was on the line. Because what is essentially taking place, if you've read the book of Maccabees, is really a civil war within Judea. There are some Jews that have embraced Hellenism and Hellenistic culture. And backed by the Syrio-Greek Empire, Antiochus Epiphanes, the emperor, they have brought paganism into the temple in Jerusalem. And this was the temple had been destroyed before. Nebuchadnezzar destroyed the first temple. This is the second temple. But this was the first time in the history of the Jews that a non-Jewish empire effectively helped enforce paganism within the temple itself. And there are Jews, and effectively, monotheism, biblical monotheism, Judaism is banned. And a revolt is led by certain priests who were zealous and loyal to the Bible and to the law. That's Matthias, Mattatyahu, and famously his sons, most well known is Judah Maccabee, which means a hammer. Now, if the people who were called Hasmoneans but have been called today the Maccabees, had they failed, there would be no Judaism and there would be no monotheism at all. This point is not made by me. This point was made by one of the most eloquent atheists and haters of biblical religion of our time. Christopher Hitchens wrote an article in, I think, Slate magazine, which was called Ba Hanukkah, about why he hates Hanukkah so much. And the reason why he hates Hanukkah, he says, is because he loves Hellenism. He loves pagan Hellenism and its culture and traditions, etc. And he hates biblical religion. And had Hanukkah failed, had the Maccabees failed, there'd be no Judaism. And then he says there'd be no, what he calls, I think these are his words, the bastard children of Judaism. There'd be no monotheistic faith at all. Now I'm going to say a phrase which I very rarely say, which is that Christopher Hitchens is right. He's right, not of course in his hatred of biblical religion, but he's right that had this not succeeded, there'd be no biblical religion. So Hanukkah is a holiday for everyone, in a certain sense. Now here's what, to me, is remarkable when we think about what it means to see exhibits or sites from the ancient world through the prism of Jewish history when it comes to Hanukkah. Antiochus, the reason why he did what he did, the emperor, is because even though he didn't rule from Athens, his empire was a different part of Alexander the Great's empire. He was one of the great evangelists of Hellenism, of pagan Hellenism. That's why he so enthusiastically enforced paganism within Israel and backed the Jews who embraced paganism. The testament to that is a building that he built in Athens, which is called the Temple of Olympian Zeus, which more than the Parthenon was known as was known, I think, later by the Romans, because it was finished by another enemy of the Jews, Hadrian. But it was known as the one temple that was built that was truly befitting the gods. Nothing else came close. So the true testament to the great pusher of paganism can be found in ancient Athens today. But here's the thing. Temple of Olympian Zeus is a couple of Corinthian columns now. That's all it is. This was actually a huge moment for Hellenism and for Hellenistic art because it was the first temple that ever incorporated Corinthian columns. But that's all that's left, is a couple Corinthian columns. So this is the great testament to the power and passion for paganism that Antiochus had, and it's there. But here's what struck me, Eric, when I thought about the layout of ancient Greece. We both have read the dialogues of Plato, and we know that if I were to ask you, where was the true heart of Greece, the true symbol of its vibrancy? It wouldn't be at the Parthenon atop, right? It wouldn't be looming over the city. It wouldn't even be in the Temple of Olympian Zeus. It would be in the Agora. That's the marketplace. That's where Socrates would come and annoy people with his clever questions. And then when they got really annoyed and decided to try and sentence him to death, that was also in the Palace of Justice or whatever it's called. That was along the Agora. Everything is in the Agora. The Agora means the Greek marketplace. That was the heart of its life. Here's something struck me, Eric. The ritual of Hanukkah, famous, is to light a candelabra or a series of lights. Many Jews light it now inside their home, but the original idea was to light it right outside your door, outside your home. And you're remembering a vial of oil that lasted and burned longer than it should have. And the point is that you are testifying, you are witnessing to the world by remembering that miracle, by lighting this light. The mysterious endurance of the Jews, just as the flame of the menorah of the candelabra in the temple endured, so too the light of Judaism mysteriously endures. Now the Talmud says, how long must this light burn? How long, when you light the menorah right outside your home, to bear witness to the endurance of Judaism and the Jewish people, how long should it burn? So the phrase the Talmud says is that it should burn ad shetichla regel min hashuk, until the footsteps leave the marketplace. That's how you know people are no longer outside. They can no longer see the menorah. It's a famous phrase for Jews. It burns until people leave the marketplace. Here's what's interesting. If you think about, go to ancient Greece, you see the ruins of the Temple of Olympian Zeus, and then you can go where the Agora once was. The Agora is just there. There's a museum to try to recreate it, but the actual Agora is just grass and stone. There's nothing there. The people have left the marketplace. Marketplace is gone. There was a story last year, Eric, I'll end my discussion of Greece with this, and you can all look this up and find this, that there was an Israeli airline plane, El Al plane, that was flying to Israel, left Thursday night, and ended up leaving late. So it was not going to land in Tel Aviv until after Friday night, after the Jewish Sabbath had already started. There were many religious Jews on the plane, and they said, we can't travel on the Sabbath. We demand to be let out. So instead of the Israeli pilot just opening the door while they're flying and saying, please, right, he didn't do that, right? Instead, they knew they had to let them off, so they landed in Athens and let them off in Athens, and they spent the Sabbath in Athens. The Chabad rabbi of Athens put the whole thing together. This was 2 weeks before Hanukkah. And they spent the entire Sabbath together in Athens, Jews of all stripes. And then, as they leave to fly to catch the plane to Israel, they begin singing Saturday night the Hanukkah songs, which are all about Greece attempted to destroy us and to bring about paganism, and one light endured, which is a symbol of the endurance of the Jewish people. I mean, imagine if you would have told Antiochus Epiphanes that the man who created what was once the most magnificent structure in all of Athens, that many, 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 many centuries later, everything he built would be in ruins, and that the Jewish faith that he sought to destroy would be celebrating the Sabbath, and the Sabbath was one of the things that they assaulted, the pagans, in the book of Maccabees, would be celebrating the Sabbath in Athens, and then leaving to get on a plane to fly back to Israel, back to Jerusalem, where there's now still a flourishing Jewish state. How could you not see the poetry in that?
So, in that same spirit, one of the videos that we shot at the Bible Museum in this series was about Rome, about the confrontation of the Jewish people with the Roman Empire, the subjugation of the Jewish people by the Roman Empire. And you zero in on this famous place in Rome, the Arch of Titus, which was a symbol of the oppression of the Jews that became much later in Jewish history, in modern Jewish history, a symbol of the miracle of the Jewish rebirth in Israel. So why don't you set this up, and then why don't we actually show this clip? Because it suggests that the miracles of Jewish endurance are not just an ancient story, but also a modern story.
Very much so. So let's set up both the history and the religious background very briefly. The Roman assault and destruction of the Second Temple in Jerusalem occurs in 70 CE. It's led by Vespasian, who becomes emperor, and by his son Titus. Precisely because they don't have a huge resume, and before that, Roman emperors tended to end up dead, they needed to build up their achievements, which is why the assault was so quick and so brutal. Usually you don't destroy a perfectly good city. You enslave it. You make it part of your empire. But here, Jerusalem was utterly ravaged and destroyed, so that you can go to the Temple Mount today and see below the Temple Mount stones that were thrown down from the Roman assault, massive stones. And then they remade Rome, Vespasian and Titus, in their own image, effectively putting announcements of their destruction of Jerusalem everywhere. They minted coins that said Judea Capta. That's in the collection of the Museum of the Bible. You could see it there. Judea is destroyed, sending these coins throughout the empire. And they created memorializations of their victory. The most famous is their invention of a whole new way of celebrating the achievements of empire, which then was mimicked throughout other empires, which was a triumphal arch. This arch that would depict on it these great military victories. So, like the Arc de Triomphe in Paris, but the original is what's called the Arch of Titus. And on one side of the arch, there's a depiction of the parade of the temple treasures that the Romans engaged in. Brought Jewish prisoners, actually slaughtered in Rome one of the leaders of the rebellion against Rome, the Jewish rebellion against Rome. And most famously, because this is depicted on the arch, bearing the golden candelabra that we celebrate in the Hanukkah story above their shoulders, beautiful golden menorah, the candelabra of the temple. This becomes etched in, because it's preserved more than other Roman triumphal depictions, it becomes etched in the Jewish imagination as the greatest symbol of Jewish defeat. Now, even after the destruction of the temple, the rabbis of Judea continued to visit Rome. They needed to go for political reasons at time. And they would see these triumphal depictions of the destruction of Jerusalem, and probably at one point were even able to see the original vessels of Jerusalem, because the Romans housed them in a museum, which they called the Temple of Peace. A thing called the Temple of Peace. That's like when, Syria and North Korea gets to sit on the UN Human Rights Commission. So Rome had a Temple of Peace, which basically meant all the stuff from all the places they conquered. So they would actually see it. And you can think of how heartbreaking it was for them, that Judea and Jerusalem especially is entirely destroyed. And here their beautiful vessels of the temple are in Rome, the most powerful empire that has ever existed on earth. And yet, the person who existed at one of the most difficult points in Jewish history, but is always the eternal optimist in rabbinic literature, a rabbi named Rabbi Akiva, we are told once visited Rome with his colleagues, rabbinic colleagues, and as they heard the noise coming from the Roman Forum, which is right around where the Arch of Titus is, they all wept because the Temple Mount in Jerusalem was desolate, and this is the hubbub of civilization, he laughed and predicted that one day Rome would be destroyed and that the words of the prophet Zechariah about Jerusalem would be fulfilled, that grandparents and grandchildren will sit once again in the streets of Jerusalem. And they famously said to him, Akiva nichamtano, Rabbi Akiva, you have consoled us. And that has also loomed large through many centuries when the very prediction may have seemed preposterous, as a promise that Rabbi Akiva's prediction would be fulfilled. So that, I think, sets up the conclusion to our video, Jews, the Case for God, of Rome.
The inversion of the meaning of the Arch of Titus.
The inversion of the meaning of the Arch of Titus, exactly.
Okay, why don't we try to show this clip?
In 1947, the United Nations voted to approve the partition plan and allow a Jewish state to come into being. And suddenly, upon news of that vote, in Rome, hundreds, thousands of Jews, as if by instinct, gathered at the Arch, Zionist flags flying, Jews who were displaced persons, Jews who only recently had been in concentration camps. And suddenly, as one, they all walked under the Arch, but in the reverse direction than that taken by Titus upon his triumphal entry into the city, thereby signaling with their Zionist flags the reversal of what Rome had wrought. A Jewish state came into being and chose as its seal the menorah, exactly as it was depicted on the Arch of Titus. 19 years after that, Israeli forces entered the old city of Jerusalem, and a Jewish flag flew from the locus of Jewish aspirations and the Temple Mount for the first time since Titus's destruction. Truly, what Rabbi Akiva predicted almost 2,000 years ago, at a time when such a prediction would have appeared insane, that all the might and glory of Rome would disappear, his prediction has come true in our time. Rome is no more. There are Romance languages, but no one speaks Latin today. The glory and the might of the Forum that Akiva heard is now an eerie silence. Meanwhile, exactly as Akiva predicted, Jerusalem is rebuilt. Its streets are filled with children playing. The hubbub of their joyous voices is heard, and their grandfathers and grandmothers sit on benches nearby and look lovingly upon them. How do we understand this? How can what Rabbi Akiva predicted have actually come true before our very eyes? In Jerusalem, one witnesses the miracle of Jewish history and the vindication of Akiva's faith. But if one goes to Rome and stands in the midst of what was once the mightiest place on earth and ponders a menorah, one will, in that very non-Jewish place, suddenly find the case for God.
So we've been talking about these incredible moments in the ancient Jewish past. Egypt, Assyria, Greece, Rome. But that story and your argument is that the miracle of Jewish history endures, and that the rebirth of modern Israel is itself a kind of miraculous revelation of the providential hand that guides history. That's your big argument. So we're thinking now about the sequel to this, which we're calling Israel, the Case for God. And I wonder if we could think about a couple of moments in the few minutes we have left where it's so improbable what happened.
Right.
So maybe start with Truman, right? President Truman in 1948 is the president who recognizes immediately the birth of this new independent sovereign Jewish state. What happened? What was so miraculous about Truman?
So you have to, if you think about from the beginning of the modern Zionist movement through the establishment of the independence of Israel, there are so many unlikely events leading up to that moment. And if each one had not happened, there might not be a state of Israel today. Maybe I can step back for 1 minute to start from the beginning of the Zionist movement, which is Theodor Herzl. Theodor Herzl was an assimilated Austrian Jew, lived in Vienna, part of the elite society. And all of a sudden, he decides to throw his lot in with the persecuted Jews of Eastern Europe and come up with an idea that seemed crazy, that Jews could restart a Jewish state and restart a political movement. That alone is just an unlikely dream from the unlikeliest person. You know, Eric, I Google mapped this, and Theodor Herzl in Vienna lived a 2-minute walk from Sigmund Freud's house and practice. I think it was Elie Wiesel who said that they never met. It's a good thing he said they corresponded but never met. He said it's a good thing they never met, because Herzl would have gone to see Freud, and he would have said to him, I have this unbelievable dream that Jews can, return and start can return to start a Jewish state. And Freud would have said, sit down on the couch and I'll explain to you that it's all because you hate your parents or something like that.
That would have been the end of it.
That would have been the end of Israel. But that's a joke, but the truth is, Freud, who was definitely not a believer, wrote a pretty crazy book called Moses and Monotheism, where he said that basically there's no way the biblical story could be true. Why? He says, because the Bible unfolds with the opposite story of all other ancient tales. He says something like, every ancient tale has a story where somebody who was born a child of the gods or of royalty is lost, and he grows up among slaves, and he reclaims his identity as whatever, a divine being or as royalty, etc. He says, but Moses is the exact opposite story, because Moses is raised in the house of Pharaoh in royalty, and he reclaims his identity as a slave. It can't be, he says. It can't be. So it must be made up. That's what he says. But the striking thing is that no one is Moses. Even the other prophets that follow Moses are not Moses. But actually in modern Israel, part of its birth is a story about someone who grows up amongst the elite. It's Theodor Herzl. An elite Viennese Jew has all the opportunities available for him, and he decides to throw in his lot with persecuted Jewry and to devote what was left of his life, which turned out to be not so much, to restoring the Jewish people. And so that itself is one of the most unlikely of stories. But it's a parallel to the poetry of Jewish history itself. And then as you think about this unfolding then, and you get to 1948, and the fate of what happens in the Holy Land is left to the United Nations, it's basically going to be decided by 2 different blocks. The Western bloc, in which the most significant figure is Truman, and the Eastern bloc, which is, of course, USSR, Stalin. So let's just talk about Truman first. So first of all, you have to think about David McCullough's biography of Truman is one of my favorite books. I've read parts of it maybe 50 times. You have to think about how unlikely is the fact that he actually was there. So let's start with Truman is serving in World War I, and he meets there a man by the name of Eddie Jacobson who's serving with him. Knows he's a Jewish guy, decides to partner with him and run the canteen. Canteen does very well. And he writes back to his wife, Bess Truman, he says, I have a Jew here and he's doing great at running the canteen, or something like that. That's what he writes. And everybody said that they started calling Truman Jewish because he was good at running the canteen also, and his nickname was Trumanheimer in the canteen. They come back to Missouri, they go into the haberdashery business together. That's what they were. He was not a statesman. Truman was a shirt salesman. And not a great one, perhaps, because their business failed. So he decides to go into politics. And he becomes part of the political machine of Missouri. Again, not affiliated with great statesmen. But it just happens to be, that in 1944, FDR in his 4th election needs somebody that will be just right to be on the ticket. And as the biography describes, he writes on a note, he says, you can pick Douglas or Truman. And then the guy who took it down had the secretary, according to his story, switch the names, Truman or Douglas, and pass that around at the National Convention. Truman becomes president, again, soon after the inauguration, a man who no one would have predicted to be president, no one at all. And the man who becomes the Secretary of State is the man he reveres more than anyone else in the world, which is General Marshall. General Marshall does not want the Arab countries angry at America. People at the State Department, who Truman called the striped pants boys, doesn't want anybody angry at America. They say you should not support independence for what was called partition of Palestine, independence for a Jewish state. Truman overrides him originally, and then he's pushing again to revoke the plan for independence. Marshall is pushing. And when things seemed very dire, Truman's old friend, Eddie Jacobson, came in to see him. Truman refused to see Chaim Weizmann, the representative of the Zionist movement. And Eddie Jacobson says something like, he points to the statue of Andrew Jackson on Truman's desk. And he says, Harry, he calls him Harry, the President of the United States. You have a hero, because Andrew Jackson was his hero. He says, I also have a hero. It's Chaim Weizmann. Now, this whole comparison itself is, as was noted, totally preposterous, because no people could be less alike than Andrew Jackson and Chaim Weizmann. But he says, you have a hero, and I have a hero too, and it's not like you, Harry, to not want to meet him. And he turns around, stares out the window, and then turns back and says to Eddie Jacobson, all right, you bald-headed SOB, I'll meet him. Eddie Jacobson was the only Jew, a representative of the Jewish community, who was allowed in to see Truman. And he was only allowed to see him if he promised he would not bring up Zionism, and he lied, and then came in and brought it up. So, had they not met each other in World War I, had Jacobson been a jerk in running the canteen, had Truman not become president, there's a very strong possibility that the Western Bloc would not have supported independence for the Jewish state. And that's just one of many, many, many different details that lead to the birth of Israel.
And what's the Stalin miracle?
So the Stalin one is, so again here you have a genocidal maniac who is enormously anti-Semitic. And yet for a brief moment, not only decides to endorse the birth of a Jewish state, but actually allows Czechoslovakia, which is in the Soviet orbit, to supply them with weapons. That was their main source of weapons, Czechoslovakia. My great uncle, Rabbi Joseph Soloveichik, describes this as one of the great miracles. This was the one time, perhaps in the history of the UN, that the Eastern Bloc and the Western Bloc both support something in the UN. And the way my great uncle put it is, some may find this harsh, I don't, but what he said he says, he believes that the United Nations was brought into existence for this moment. He said this in the 1950s, but I think it stands up today. He says, I've been looking and I haven't been able to find any other achievements from the United Nations. You have this one moment where the UN, both sides come together. Why? Stalin wanted to check what he saw as the British reach. And since the British had held Palestine before, this was a way of messing over the British. So he took a brief break. And it's only because of these two things that aligned, Truman and Stalin. That's why Paul Johnson, the great Christian historian, said that when he thought about these events, he said that in the 20th century, over 100 nations have come into being, but only Israel's coming into being is an event that can be described as a miracle, because a tiny political window just at the right moment opened when both Stalin and Truman allowed Israel to come into being. Think about it. The way you put it is that Stalin is sort of one of the fathers of the modern state of Israel. Well, what could be a greater miracle than one of the most anti-Semitic genocidal maniacs of the 20th century can help bring the Jewish state into being?
So as we bring this set of reflections to some conclusion, I'd like to think about not only the miracle of Jewish history, but the message of the Jewish people.
Right.
So what's clear is that many Americans, and I'd say especially many religious Christians, have come to see Jerusalem, Israel, as an important cause, a kind of almost the moral rallying cry of the West in a way. So why is Israel and the people of Israel, the Israelites, why are they so important as we think about Western civilization today?
So you've written a wonderful essay, which I recommend to the whole audience, on Tikvah's online magazine, Mosaic, about Jerusalem. Do you remember the title?
The Message of Jerusalem.
The Message of Jerusalem. And the basic thesis, I'll summarize it here, is that over the decades since Israel was born, and the many other miraculous moments in Israel's history, the Six-Day War, the return to the old city of Jerusalem, even as Israel has grown stronger and flourished, and even as biblical prophecies seems to have been fulfilled. Isaiah's, "For God has consoled Zion and made its wilderness into a garden," which you can see. You can go to the desert and see the desert is blooming. People have returned. Descriptions in Isaiah like the streets into Jerusalem will be too crowded. Israeli taxi drivers sit and curse the traffic. But that's a miracle. That's predicted in Isaiah. Which, I try to remind myself when I'm sitting uncomfortably in a cab in Israel and the Israeli traffic driver is cursing the traffic. What seems prosaic to us is a miracle. But as all these miracles have happened and the biblical prophecies, some of them seem to be fulfilled, the West itself, the culture of the West, has lost its faith. And actually, at times, in certain Western societies, biblical faith, religious freedom, is even under assault. And so, in this very setting, in the rise of secularism, many people of faith around the world see in the events of the story of Israel, and especially in Jerusalem, the ultimate embodiment for the case for the truth of all that the Bible proclaims. And first and foremost, it's case for biblical monotheism and the entire ethical worldview and spiritual worldview that comes with it. So I read your essay, Eric, which I thought was incredible. And then I was just sitting one day in Jerusalem, breakfast, a miraculous experience, of course, for anybody who's experienced an Israeli breakfast in a hotel. And you usually just focus on food. And they were interviewing president of a South American country that was planning to move their embassy to Jerusalem after. And he says something like they're going to move the embassy or at least create some offshoot there. And he's talking about why is it important? Why is it important that they move it from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem? And the way he put it is he said, it's just a symbol, but it's very important to the people in my country who believe in God. You think about it as if somebody who's thousands of miles away in a country in South America, and yet somehow their own belief in God is tied up with their country having representation in Jewish Jerusalem. And it brought home to me what you wrote, which is today, Jerusalem may well be the beacon for biblical faith, for those of biblical faith who feel that they are at sea in a culture that has lost its faith. So that's why I hope that this case for God that we're putting forward here with Tikvah's video series is a case that will speak not just to Jews, but to thousands and thousands of people of faith around the world who see in Israel and in Jerusalem and the biblical beacon that it is.
Well, Rabbi Soloveichik, I want to thank you for this both sweeping and inspiring account of Jewish history. For those of you who haven't seen these videos, I really encourage you to do so. They're really incredibly powerful on Jews, the case for God. And stay tuned, hopefully soon, for the sequel, where we'll look more carefully at some of these modern miracles of the rebirth of Israel and what that might mean for America, for the West, and for people of faith everywhere looking for guidance in the modern age. So, Rabbi Soloveichik, thank you.
Thank you. And thank you.
We want to thank again the Bible Museum, and we will turn this back to Washington.
And thank you, Rabbi Soloveichik and Eric Cohen, for sharing with us your provocative idea, your engaging conversation together, and for connecting dots of history for us from the Bible down to the present day. Thank you for joining us tonight. We do invite you, as you are able, to visit Museum of the Bible and learn more about the history of the Bible, the stories of the Bible, and the impact of the Bible from the ancient world down to the present day, and see some of that history that Rabbi Soloveichik was discussing here for yourself with your own eyes. I know for myself, probably like many of you, I'll be taking Rabbi Soloveitchik's advice and watching out for those Hittites on the way home. And I hope you all stay safe. Thank you for joining us.